Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we help make workplace safety less, well, dry.
Yeah.
Let's face it, safety regulations aren't exactly known for being the most thrilling reads.
True that.
But today we're going to try and spice things up a bit as we delve into OSHA 1926.151. That's the one about fire prevention on construction sites.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one.
And trust me when I say it's absolutely crucial for anyone working in or around construction.
Especially safety professionals.
Hey, you got it. We're talking about protecting lives and property here, folks.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, before we jump headfirst into the OSHA standard itself, let's set the scene a bit, shall we?
Sure.
Picture this. A construction site bustling with activity, materials stacked everywhere, sparks flying from welding torches, power tools buzzing all around.
And let's not forget those temporary buildings and all the flammable stuff they often contain.
Right, you've got wood, fuels, solvents, maybe even some hazardous materials lying around.
It's basically a tinderbox waiting for a spark.
Exactly. So that's where OSHA 1926.151 comes in. It's all about minimizing those fire risks and creating a safer work environment.
Makes sense.
All right, let's break down this standard section by section and see what nuggets of wisdom we can extract.
Sounds good.
We'll start with 1926.151A, which tackles those sneaky ignition hazards.
Always a good place to start.
Now, I'm sure we've all heard the horror stories about faulty wiring causing fires.
Oh, yeah, it happens more often than you'd think.
And that's why the standard kicks things off by emphasizing the importance of proper electrical installations.
Right. It even points you to subpart K for the full rundown on electrical safety.
So it's like a built-in reminder to double-check your electrical systems and make sure everything is up to code.
Always a good idea.
But it's not just about electricity. The standard also dives into some seemingly minor details, like engine exhaust.
Oh, you mean those hot fumes spewing out of equipment?
Exactly. You might think, oh, it's just exhaust. But those fumes can easily ignite nearby combustible materials if they're not directed away properly.
So what does the standard say about that?
Well, it mandates a specific 6-inch clearance for exhaust pipes, ensuring those hot gases are kept well away from anything flammable.
Ah, I see. So it's all about creating that safe buffer zone.
Precisely. It's those little details that can make a big difference when it comes to fire prevention.
Absolutely. Now, this next one might seem like a no-brainer, but the standard is very clear about smoking regulation.
Yeah, no lighting up near those flammable materials, right?
Exactly. The standard effectively bans smoking anywhere near operations that could pose a fire risk.
It's like, put those cigarettes out, people. We're not messing around with fire hazards here.
And to make sure the message is crystal clear, the standard also requires no smoking signs to be prominently displayed.
Gotta love that clear communication. Leaves no room for interpretation.
Definitely. But it's not just cigarettes we have to think about. The standard also tackles other potential sources of ignition, like lighting equipment.
Ah, good point. Especially when you're working around flammable gases or liquids, using the wrong type of lighting could be a recipe for disaster.
Couldn't agree more. That's why the standard mandates approved battery-powered lighting in those situations.
Smart move. Eliminates the risk of sparks from electrical equipment.
It's all about removing those potential ignition sources.
Yeah, here's one that always makes me scratch my head a bit. Bonding for ventilation.
Ah, bonding, that can be a tricky one.
I mean, I get the general idea of preventing static electricity buildup, but how does it actually work in practice?
So imagine you're cleaning or ventilating a tank that contains flammable gases or vapors.
Okay, got it.
Now, the nozzles you use for that process need to be bonded to the tank shell.
Bonded? How?
Basically, it's like creating a safe pathway for any stray electrical charge to flow to the ground.
Interesting. So it's like diverting that static electricity away from the flammable stuff.
Precisely. That prevents a potentially explosive spark from igniting those gases or vapors.
Makes sense now. It's like creating a safety net for those invisible electrical charges.
You got it. And it highlights how the OSHA standard really delves into the finer points of fire prevention.
It's not just about the big, obvious stuff. It's about addressing those seemingly small risks that could have major consequences.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears and talk about temporary buildings. Those structures that seem to pop up and disappear like mushrooms on construction sites.
And let's be honest, they're often a bit more, shall we say, flammable than permanent structures.
True, which is why the standard lays out some specific requirements for them.
Like what?
Well, first and foremost, they can't block any exit routes.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one. You don't want people trapped inside a burning building with no way out.
Exactly. And then there are the fire resistance requirements.
So a temporary building inside another structure needs to be either non-combustible or have a fire resistance rating of at least 1 hour, right?
You got it. That helps contain any potential fire and buys precious time for people to evacuate safely.
It's all about creating those layers of protection.
Absolutely. Now, here's an interesting one, the 10-foot rule.
The 10-foot rule. What's that?
Basically, it means temporary buildings have to be at least 10 feet away from other structures.
Oh, I see. So it's like creating a fire break to prevent the flames from spreading.
Exactly. But there's a little twist to this rule.
Oh, there is. Tell me more.
Well, a group of temporary buildings with a combined area of less than 2,000 square feet is treated as a single building for this purpose.
So you could have a cluster of small structures closer together as long as their total footprint stays below that limit.
Precisely. It's a practical approach to managing risk while acknowledging the realities of construction sites.
I like it's not just a blanket rule. It takes into account the specific circumstances.
Exactly. Now let's step outside for a moment and talk about open yard storage. That's 1926.151C.
Ah, the land of towering piles of lumber and other goodies.
And you know what? They actually have regulations for those towering piles.
They do? Really?
Oh yeah, the standard sets a maximum height of 20 feet for combustible material piles.
20 feet. Wow, that's pretty tall.
It is. But there's a good reason for that limit. It helps minimize the risk of collapse.
Ah, that makes sense. A collapsing pile could not only spread a fire, but it could also injure workers.
Exactly. It's all about preventing those domino effects.
And speaking of preventing domino effects, let's talk about driveways.
Ah, yes, the arteries of the construction site.
The standard is pretty specific about those too, right?
You bet. They need to be at least 15 feet wide.
That's wider than my car.
And kept clear of any obstacles.
No parking those dump trucks in the fire lane.
Nope. And they have to be laid out in a grid system no larger than 50 by 150 feet.
So it's like creating a network of fire breaks throughout the storage yard.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That ensures fire trucks can access the site quickly and maneuver effectively in case of an emergency.
It's all about giving those firefighters a fighting chance.
Absolutely. Now, beyond just the driveways, the entire storage site needs to be kept free from unnecessary combustible materials.
No random piles of scrap wood lying around.
Nope. And weeds and grass need to be controlled as well.
So it's like creating a clean slate, minimizing the fuel for a potential fire.
Exactly. And the standard goes even further. If there's any risk of an underground fire, you can't store combustible materials in that area at all.
Underground fire.
What's that?
It's basically a fire that's burning beneath the surface, often in soil or peat.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a nightmare to extinguish.
They can be incredibly difficult to contain. Now, let's talk about piling methods, how you actually stack those materials.
So there's a right way and a wrong way to make a pile.
You bet. The standard encourages solid piling whenever possible.
Solid piling. As opposed to what?
Well, sometimes you see piles that are kind of loose and haphazard with gaps and spaces between the material.
Ah, I see. So solid piling means packing those materials tightly together.
Exactly. It creates a more stable pile and reduces the surface area exposed to potential ignition sources.
Makes sense. It's like building a fortress against fire.
And speaking of fortresses, no combustible material can be stored within 10 feet of a building.
Ah, another one of those buffer zones. Precisely. Now, we can't forget about those trusty fire extinguishers. They're the first line of defense against a small fire.
Absolutely. Every construction site should have plenty of them on hand.
And not just any fire extinguisher. They need to be the right type for the potential fires that could occur on the site.
So what does the standard say about that?
Well, it specifies a minimum 2A rating for the extinguishers, which means they can handle ordinary combustibles like wood and paper.
Okay, got it. And where do they need to be located?
They have to be accessible and within 100 feet of any point in the yard.
So no sprinting across the entire site to grab an extinguisher when a fire breaks out?
Exactly. It's all about having those tools readily available when you need them.
Now let's move on to 1926.151D, which covers indoor storage.
Moving from the great outdoors to those more confined spaces.
So what are some of the key considerations when it comes to storing materials indoors?
Well, just like with temporary buildings, storage can't obstruct any exit routes.
Safety first, always.
Absolutely. But when you're storing materials indoors, you have to pay close attention to their fire characteristics.
Fire characteristics. What do you mean?
Things like flash points and ignition temperatures.
Oh, right. Those tell you how easily a material can ignite and how intensely it will burn.
Exactly. You need to understand those properties to determine the safest ways to store and handle different materials.
It's like having a fire safety profile for each material.
Precisely. You're not just reacting to a fire, you're actively preventing it by understanding the materials you're working with.
I like that proactive approach.
Yeah.
And I imagine the standard also addresses the issue of incompatible materials.
You bet. If you have materials that could create a fire hazard when stored together, they need to be separated.
Like flammable liquids and oxidizing agents, those don't mix well.
Not at all. They need to be kept apart by a barrier with a fire resistance rating of at least 1 hour.
So it's like creating a safety zone between those potential troublemakers.
Exactly. It's all about creating those layers of protection.
Now it's not just about what you store, but how you store it, right?
Absolutely. The way materials are piled should minimize the internal spread of fire, allow access for firefighters, and even accommodate the widest fire vehicle that might need to enter the building.
So it's like creating strategic pathways for firefighters to access the fire and for people to evacuate safely.
That's a great way to put it. And then there are those all-important clearance requirements.
Oh, right. Those are crucial for maintaining access and preventing fires from spreading.
Exactly. We need to maintain that 36-inch clearance between the top of stored materials and sprinkler deflectors.
So those sprinklers can do their job if a fire breaks out.
And we need clearances around lights and heating units to prevent them from igniting nearby materials.
It's all about eliminating those accidental ignition sources.
And of course, fire doors need a clear path of travel as well.
Those are like the emergency exits on an airplane. They need to be readily available.
Precisely. The standard requires a 24-inch clearance around fire doors or a barricade if there's absolutely no way to achieve that clearance.
And I'm guessing materials can't be stacked right up against those fire doors either.
You guessed right. You need to maintain at least 36 inches of clear space around fire door openings.
So it's like creating a safe zone around those escape routes.
Exactly. And speaking of escape routes, remember that accessibility is key throughout the entire storage area.
No blocking those exits with piles of junk.
Nope. People need to be able to get out quickly and safely if a fire breaks out.
Wow. That's a lot to consider when it comes to indoor storage.
It is, but it all boils down to this. We're trying to create a safe environment for everyone working in and around those storage areas.
It makes sense. It's all about minimizing those fire risks and protecting lives.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much detail goes into fire prevention on a construction site.
I know, right? Not just about having a fire extinguisher handy.
It's about creating a whole culture of safety, thinking ahead, and anticipating potential problems.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that really stood out to me in the last segment was how the standard emphasizes those clearances, especially around fire doors.
Oh, yeah, those are crucial.
I mean, it makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
You need to ensure those exits are clear and accessible at all times.
Exactly. In a fire, every second counts. And you don't want people fumbling around trying to move stuff out of the way to escape.
Right. It's about having those escape routes readily available, just like on an airplane.
And it's not just for the workers' safety either. Those clearances also allow firefighters to access the building quickly and efficiently.
It's like creating those strategic pathways we talked about earlier.
Precisely. It's all about giving those firefighters a fighting chance to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading.
Now, another thing that I found really interesting was the emphasis on understanding the fire characteristics of the materials you're storing.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's not just about keeping flammable stuff away from ignition sources. It's also about knowing how those materials will behave in a fire.
Exactly. You need to know things like flash points, ignition temperatures, how quickly a material will burn, how much heat it will generate.
Right, it's like having a fire safety profile for each material.
Precisely. You need that information to make informed decisions about storage locations, handling procedures, even the type of fire extinguishers you need to have on hand.
It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Absolutely. You're not just waiting for a fire to happen, you're actively preventing it by understanding the materials you're working with.
Now, even with all these precautions in place, things can still change quickly on a construction site, right?
Oh, absolutely. Construction sites are dynamic environments. Materials are delivered, work areas shift, temporary structures go up and down.
So how do you keep up with all those changes and make sure fire safety is always a top priority?
That's where regular inspections and hazard assessments come in.
So it's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. You need to constantly be evaluating the site, identifying potential hazards, and adjusting your safety measures accordingly.
It's like taking the pulse of the construction site, making sure everything is running smoothly and safely.
Precisely. And that's where good communication comes into play as well.
Oh, absolutely. You need to make sure everyone on the site is aware of the fire hazards and their role in prevention.
Exactly. From the workers handling flammable materials to the supervisors overseeing the project, everyone needs to be on the same page.
It's about fostering that culture of safety we talked about earlier.
Right, where everyone feels empowered to speak up about concerns and everyone understands the importance of following the rules.
And that's where resources like Safety One Source can be incredibly valuable.
Oh, absolutely. Their website and YouTube channel offer a wealth of information on workplace safety, including fire prevention on construction sites.
It's like having a safety expert in your pocket, ready to answer your questions and guide you through the complexities of OSHA regulations.
They do a fantastic job of breaking down complex topics into easy-to-understand language and providing practical, actionable advice.
It's all about making safety accessible and understandable for everyone.
Now, as we continue our deep dive into OSHA 1926.151, let's revisit some of the key takeaways we've discussed so far.
All right, sounds good. So what are the main points we want our listeners to remember?
Well, first and foremost, this OSHA standard is the go-to guide for anyone involved in construction site safety.
It's like the Bible of fire prevention on construction sites.
Exactly. It provides a comprehensive framework for minimizing fire risks and protecting workers.
From addressing those common ignition sources to outlining specific storage and handling procedures, it covers all the bases.
And remember, it's not just about memorizing a bunch of rules.
It's about understanding the why behind those rules and applying those principles to real-world situations.
Exactly. Why is it so important to bond nozzles when cleaning tanks with flammable vapors? Why are those 10-foot clearances between structures so critical?
It's about connecting the dots and recognizing the bigger picture of fire prevention.
And it's about shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive one.
Right, not just waiting for a fire to happen, but actively anticipating potential hazards and taking steps to mitigate those risks.
Exactly. It's about being vigilant, being prepared, and always putting safety first.
You know, as we've been discussing this OSHA standard, I've been thinking about the human element of fire prevention.
Oh, that's an important aspect.
We've talked about the physical environment, the materials being used, the work practices in place.
Right.
But what about the role of individual attitudes and behaviors?
Ah, that's a crucial point. You could have the most robust safety procedures in the world, but if people aren't properly trained or if they're simply not paying attention,
Then those procedures won't be effective.
Exactly. It's like having a state-of-the-art security system, but leaving the front door wide open.
So how do we create a work environment where everyone is truly invested in fire prevention? How do we cultivate that safety-first mentality?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a complex challenge that involves leadership, communication, training.
And a genuine commitment to making safety a core value, not just a box to be checked.
Absolutely. It's about leading by example, empowering workers, and fostering a culture where safety is everyone's responsibility.
And that's a perfect segue into the final part of the deep dive.
Where we'll explore practical strategies for building that culture of fire prevention on construction sites.
All right, so we've spent a good chunk of time unpacking this OSHA standard, but let's get real for a second.
Yeah.
Rules and regulations are great, but they're only effective if they're actually put into practice, right?
Absolutely.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we take this dry technical stuff and transform it into a thriving safety culture on those construction sites?
Well, it all starts at the top, you know?
Taxation.
Exactly. The site supervisors, the managers, they set the tone.
They're the ones calling the shots.
If they're cutting corners or prioritizing production over safety, well, that message trickles down, doesn't it?
Sends a pretty clear signal to the workers, yeah.
But when leadership walks the walk, when they emphasize and enforce those safety protocols consistently, that makes a huge difference.
It's like setting an example, showing everyone that safety isn't just an afterthought.
Exactly. Actions speak louder than words, right?
Absolutely. So we're talking about more than just putting up a safety poster in the break room.
Way more. It's about making safety a part of the daily routine.
Regular safety meetings, toolbox talks, site inspections.
You got it. And not just going through the motions, but really engaging with the workers, making sure they understand the why behind the rules.
Encouraging them to ask questions, raise concern.
Exactly. It's about creating that two-way communication, making safety a collaborative effort.
It's about ownership, right? Making sure everyone feels responsible for safety.
Absolutely. And that sense of ownership is amplified when you invest in proper training.
Oh yeah, training is key
And it shouldn't be a one-and-done thing, you know?
to keep it fresh.
Regular refreshers covering hazard identification, safe work practices, emergency procedures.
What to do in case of a fire, how to use a fire extinguisher.
Exactly. Equip those workers with the knowledge and skills they need to not only follow the rules, but to understand why those rules exist in the first place.
It's about making them active participants in safety.
Exactly. And sometimes you got to go beyond the classroom, you know?
Get hands-on.
Exactly. Demonstrations, simulations, site-specific walkthroughs.
Make it real for those workers.
Exactly. Help them connect the dots between theory and practice.
But even with the best training in the world, communication is still key, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You got to make sure those safety messages are getting through.
Loud to clear.
Easy to understand signage, toolbox talks that focus on specific hazards.
And always encourage feedback, right?
Always. A two-way dialogue is crucial.
Workers need to feel comfortable speaking up, voicing concerns.
Exactly. And when they see that those concerns are taken seriously, that builds trust.
It shows them that safety is truly a priority.
And that encourages everyone to be more vigilant, more proactive.
Speaking of resources, I think it's time for another shout out to our friends at Safety One Source.
Oh, yeah. They're a fantastic resource.
Their website and YouTube channel are jam-packed with information on workplace safety.
Everything from hazard identification to fire extinguisher selection and placement.
It's like having a virtual safety consultant at your fingertips.
And they do a great job of making that information accessible to everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into fire prevention on construction sites, what's the key takeaway? What do we want our listeners to remember?
I think it comes down to this. Creating a culture of safety is an ongoing process.
It's not a one-and-done deal,
It takes effort, commitment, and a willingness to adapt.
and it's an investment that pays off in countless ways.
Protecting workers, preventing property damage, and creating a more positive work environment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive, where we help you navigate the world of workplace safety.
And remember, safety is everyone's responsibility.
Stay safe out there, folks.